Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, let me just set up my timer. Um, POIs through chat. The pronouns are he and him. My speech will start in three, two, one. Ladies and gentlemen, people of the panel, 4 points of clarification before we move on to my arguments. Firstly, on the carbon market, what does this look like? This looks like businesses and governments opting into the carbon credit system, where they can potentially get away with certain kinds of generating activities by purchasing carbon credits. On both sides, we think that businesses and governments already engage in carbon markets. We are not going to argue on the merits of a carbon market, whether it's effect, whether it's positive for an environment. This debate would largely revolve around where do we do it more effectively and efficiently, where do we monitor the systems that are responsible for generating the carbon market, and where do we better make it more efficient insofar as we want to achieve carbon sustainability at the end of the day. But second point of crucial framing, the climate change that we are facing right now is a global problem. It's an international problem involving a lot of macro actors in the debate. The actors in this debate are therefore the actors most responsible for climate injustice and climate change is therefore large and scaled. So we look at this as multinational corporations, very large developed economies who are primarily responsible for climate change and therefore should be most active in buying these carbon credits. We don't think that small businesses are particularly important in this debate insofar as they have negligible impacts to the climate change that we see today. But third important framing, on in terms of our model, what is our model going to look like then? We see a unified, single, and standardized price mechanism and market system for buying and selling credits in our world. This means that there will be single price points regulated and set by large international conventions and agreements such as the Paris Accords or like the Kyoto Accords with institutions regardless of whether you are on Earth. It applies to the same mechanisms, the same regulations, and the same price systems where everyone has to buy into the same price systems. But also this looks like what then is our counter model? Fourth piece of framing. The counter model we're likely going to see from opposition would act like a stock market where price points for carbon credits are determined largely by the invisible hand of supply and demand from consumers such as businesses and governments and suppliers such as NGOs. This opt-in system then means that the negotiations for carbon credits and what price to sell these are up for debate and has subjective value in the debate. This looks like price factors such as scarcity and supply and why this is principally impossible in a carbon credit system. This means that value in their side of the debate is largely determined by individual transactions between governments and NGOs who have no idea about the carbon credit system and can easily take advantage of this system. Two arguments then for this debate. One, principally, you cannot assign a subjective value to carbon credits and therefore this is not viable.
You know
Principally,
why?
this does not make sense. There are two structural reasons for this later. One, there is no scarcity system that warrants a kind of price mechanism that you could see for consumer goods or commodities, right? The markets as we see it today emerge out of a need to regulate scarce resources through price mechanisms that properly allocate these resources to suppliers and consumers. Guess what? Carbon emissions and carbon credits are not scarce. You can infinitely reproduce them. In a world where the sky is infinitely open, there is no scarcity of carbon credits precisely because carbon credits is a social construct. You just made that out of thin air. There's just a regulatory mechanism. But secondly, carbon credits are infinitely renewable. You can always plant more trees or conserve a rainforest. There's no supply chain. There's no limited supply that could warrant like the sort of supply and demand mechanism that determines prices as we see it today. Principally, this is an unwarranted principle to base the argument on. But secondly, the unpredictable market forces warrant that this is something that we cannot deregulate. Right, the carbon market is unique as it is subject to unpredictable forces. You see this in how pandemics and natural disasters can easily disrupt prices. This is harmful as this can easily distort the real conditions of the market insofar as we want these businesses and governments to be on the same page in terms of their environmental sustainability solutions, right? The high prices of carbon credits can easily indicate that everything is going well and that we don't really have to do anything at the end of the day. This is incredibly harmful because this leads to inconsistent solutions. And more of that will be on my second argument on why pragmatically this is bad. Pragmatically, this is harmful for the environmental sustainability movement so far as this makes us inconsistent with a lot of policies. There are four reasons specific. There are four
You know why?
structural reasons for this. No, for first structural reason, it is hard to monitor. It is logistically impossible to monitor different transactions and small markets within the global scale. There are different geographics, different markets to monitor. There's the regulatory regulatory nightmare because there's no macro government to manage all this. You cannot this becomes like an NFT system where it's a free for all. It's like a cryptocurrency system where everyone can just decide what the price is. What this means is that the credit market could lose credibility because people don't trust the system. People are too confused by the system. They're therefore casted out of this mechanism, and therefore they do not buy into the system at all. But secondly, the second structural reasons why this is pragmatically bad. This is prone to loopholes. Businesses and NGOs can negotiate preferential carbon credits pricing that aligns with their self-serving interests. Likely, what is going to happen is that businesses' top priority is still going to be making a profit, right? It's going to still about money. Sustainability is largely an optics problem, insofar as they don't want to be seen as environmentally degrading. And under a decentralized system, businesses are literally incentivized to just make front companies and NGOs who can provide them with carbon credits that are easy to do or at a low price. Like say, just plant one tree and you get 5 carbon credits automatically. What's to say that this is not going to happen on their side? Businesses are currently incentivized already to go get away with a lot of loopholes in terms of taxes and carbon excess tax. This would likely translate to equally amount of loopholes under their side. But third structural reasons, no. Boom and bust of the market creates inconsistent environmental efforts. This means that companies become lenient sometimes, becomes more stringent on environmental sustainability at other times. Because the market is inherently unpredictable, as we told you in structural reason in my previous argument, this makes environmental policy incredibly inconsistent. Targets are messed up and constantly fluctuating. They're largely based on prices. They're not even reflective of the true situation. This means that it's hard to follow and hard to monitor, but largely and more harmfully, it means that it's far harder for us to hold these businesses and governments accountable. But last structural reasons, and more importantly, this is incredibly confusing insofar as it's hard for the public and governments to hold each other accountable, to hold businesses and governments, large businesses and governments accountable. Why is this true? The epistemic barrier to understanding market prices and systems is already so hard. People don't understand economics, everyone. People don't understand how the stock market works. Applying the same logic to carbon credits will only reduce social capital insofar as people who comprise the large majority of populations in the global south. With this confines them out of the academic circles who can only understand these concepts. The complexity of this market will only make it worse for social capital and collective action. Conversely, by advocating for a single price point and a standardized system that the public can easily coalesce around, we can teach kids that carbon credits is something like is 1:1. It's around concrete goals. Like this leads to concrete goals, like protesting bad companies to have this much carbon credit. It is better to collectivize. It is far harder to collectivize if the movement does not understand. This simplifies macro and micro collective action insofar as it standardizes a global set of rules that the international bodies and NGOs can easily set for all companies, but also countries can easily create and agree on universal policies that work for all companies and governments, making simple commitments that are easy to meet. With all those reasons and more, we think to be advanced to the semifinals.
Let us thank the Prime Minister for their beautiful remarks and invite the opposition to start the debate for opposition side. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah. So POS in the chat, pronouns she or her. If everyone's ready, my timer will start. Now, I think the government models of so what I get from Prime Minister does not even make sense, and it's something which is literally biased. Because the person who is setting the unified standard, as I said, it's like an international agreement or something like that. But I think there's one thing clear to no panel is that if there is someone who is actually setting this price for these people, it will be a manipulation anyways. Because big countries who are holding the most political power who just decide this easily anyways. For example, the countries who are emitting most amount of carbon dioxide, which is like developing countries, they oftentimes do not have that amount of political power to go against this big country. So that in this way, big country will definitely set a price that's going to be beneficial for them anyways. But if the prime minister is going to use like a government who is deciding this price, I think there's going to be more bias because government could simply just easily be lobbied by the big company because the big company have enough money to just literally lobby the government to set a price that is universal and beneficial for their own company. If they're letting a private company to actually setting the price for them, this is going to only favor the private companies themselves. Because if you're letting someone actually setting this price for everyone in the world, you're literally just calling out for a tool for manipulation. Because the person who is setting this price is definitely only going to choose the best price, which is the best beneficial price for themselves. We do not see how in this way can they actually monitor a more like justifiable and a more justice system or a more justice market prices to in the overall carbon system. Because what we're calling out today is both for like equality for development for both developing country and developed country, big companies and small companies. We do not see how this setting up of of the unified standard, which will eventually fall into as a manipulation tool, does not actually can reach such goals that ours is calling for today's debate, but are directly proceeding to setting up the cases for what opposition is going to tell you in today's debate. Two-layer of framing for developing country and the small companies. One, they are oftentimes not that developed. By their name, which is developing country, we can see that first of all, their economy is oftentimes not that developed, which means that their economy is not that good. And two, their overall system, including like political system, technological system, may not actually be that developed compared with developing country too. Most of the time, they do not have the capacity or technology to actually commit some like environmental friendly as the developed countries are doing. And two, we say that half for developed country, developing country, big companies, small companies, they all have different capacities in dealing with like overall environmental friendly act, which means they have different technology, they have different ability into proposing or like conducting such technology into the world today. And therefore, this is the reason why we say a unified standard market is going to be something bad, because as we analyzed before, this will only lead to a tool for manipulation in the prices, and we do not see how can developing country can even sustain this. I'll give you three-layer analysis about why developing country cannot even sustain such prices in the proposition world. First of all, politicians do not have the best knowledge setting up the prices, because what the proposition side is telling us is like some sort of like a government setting the prices. I see politicians do not even have this knowledge, because first of all, they are not even in the market themselves. Then how could they actually deal with the market in the best scenario? And two, I think what I get from the prime minister is that she's calling out for like equilateral cooperation. But how in this way can they guarantee that they can set a most suitable price for everyone, but not least of things, for example, big companies simply just manipulate everything? We say about how this scenario will eventually going to happen in proposition side, because the person who has the most power is going to decide everything. And if there's someone who is setting this price, this is definitely going to be a tool for manipulation anyways. And two, we say about how this unified market is going to be a mandatory market. What we say about this mandatory market is because if you are setting with the prices like a universal prices, you have to stick with the price where they set it, which means big companies, for example, like small companies, do not have the ability to opt in and opt out in such market, which means they have to stay in the market and purchase this like carbon credit if they are in this market, or like if they are running such organization if they want, which means the companies do not have the ability to quit if they want. But we say that such type of mandatory system, which government side claim to be something good, it's going to be something bad, because first of all, for the small businesses, they have no ability to adopt for the environmental friendly or acts or like join cooperate with the environmental friendly organization. For example, they do not have the enough technology or money to even have this such from ever happening. And secondly, they won't even opt into the market anyways, because if they have to opt in, they have to mandatory pay the price, like, which is like a universal high price for everyone. Why would they actually opt into the market? Like, why would they even have the incentive to participate in the market if they know this is mandatory and they cannot even sustain that cost for develop? And two, we see such situation in different countries are just diverse and different. For example, developing country and developed country, they have different technology, they have different economy, they have different situation. How is this unified standard going to benefit everyone if we say this already becoming a tool for manipulation in the first place? We say it's going to only benefit the rich people anyways, because the powerful people is going to set the price at the price that they want, and instead the small companies won't be benefited, because first of all, they need to pay a large amount of like carbon credit, which is like a high price, which means they have no money even on development. And two, we say they won't even join the market if they know they have to pay such price, and what the government side proposing, which is like environmental friendly, could not even be existing anyways if they know about such high prices, something that they couldn't pay. And two, what is the alternative that the opposition side can brought out into this way? As we're calling for a voluntary free market, we say in our side, large companies have the ability to actually have carbon mitigation technology, and they have the incentive to do that. Two-layer analysis. One, there's a large global pressure on companies who are not environmentally friendly. For example, if you are using something like which is like killing animals, the consumers won't just sanction you because they see how you are not protecting the environment. Such thing needs to be avoided by the company. And then these are truly second layer of analysis is that we say companies want to win a competition among consumers. That is, they need to advertise themselves as an environmentally friendly organization, so they could be benefited from the large global pressure on environmental protection. And for example, Apple companies advertising itself as a zero carbon emission. They want to win this competition among consumers, and they themselves have the ability for carbon mitigation, and therefore they have the incentive to actually help the small company to deal with like carbon emission or like carbon friendly. That we say at least on the company level, ours can directly win this debate, because one, we can have all the benefit that our opponents have, which is protecting the environment, and two, we directly solve the issue such that there's no carbon credit, there will be no carbon credit from the small companies, and ours that directly produce this incentive for the big companies to help the small country anyways in the end. So therefore, we say that we're going to stabilize the overall market of the carbon emission, because the decentralized market does not look like something which is very messy. Because in our side, if you are not having the action that can manipulate the overall market competition will happen. For example, what is happening in free market, consumers have the time and capacity to adjust to the prices, and producers have the capacity to directly adjust to the price that we are calling up to this debate. And therefore, that we say, first of all, we're going to benefit the small countries and small companies more, because in our side, we can let them quickly adjust to the prices and we can directly solve this whole issue, which there's no tool for manipulation in the opposite side. And secondly, we say we're going to deal with the environmental issue because we analyze the incentive for the big companies to actually deal with such issue for the small companies. Based on this, very proud to oppose.
This House thanks the Leader of Opposition and welcomes the Deputy Prime Minister to sum up the case for opening government. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. POS your voice and preferably at the latter part of my review. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In a world with the inevitable problem of climate change that affects each and every single individual, whereas the actions and the decisions of a corporation and a government heavily affects the collective state of the world, we think that in our model, whereas you standardize the price points and the contingent values of green initiatives relies on necessary requisites, not on the ultimate liberation and the hands of the oppressors like corporations and etc., we think that regardless if there's a goal of net zero, the decentralization itself makes it more so that the net zero is not a goal, but insofar as not a priority of corporations, as they can be ultimately flexible with the mandates, they can also dictate when and where to opt in, which puts the convenience at a premium. If this is a debate about reimagining a world where people are happy and that the environment is generally safer for everyone, we think that a single unified carbon market is the way to go. But firstly, on clarification, this is a preferred world. This is a debate on which side has the world, whereas the standards of fairness and safety would likely occur in the nuance of the comparative of single market carbon markets versus the decentralized ones, right? It is comparative. If it is in comparative, opposition would claim that one, a decentralized voluntary market would heighten the barrier to entry for other corporations to initiate green projects. This debate is about the scales and the magnitude of the impact. It means that if we're being intuitive, we're not removing the responsibility of other corporations to have green initiatives. There'll still be national mandates and other things like the switch to eco bags, for example, or how schools would not sell plastic spoons or whatever. This is an important clarification, because this debate plays on the multinational companies as they are the main perpetrators of the oppression towards the environment. They're also the ones who puts up massive dumps and factories near the sea. They're the corporations who are responsible for multiple garbage trucks dumped into developing countries like the Philippines or Thailand. So by scale and magnitude, and by that standards alone, this policy works on massive corporations who have the responsibility to not opt in but literally contribute to the fixing of the world. Why is that important then in this debate? Number one, because the framing is very important. Whereas there's regulation of agreements and institutions, there's a unified standardized price for buying credits. This is important because number one, subjectivity of credit or of like carbon credits is easier to manipulate in their side. It means that if they're willing to invest on a market that is highly democratic and reliant on the participation of corporations, it means that it caters no value when people do opt out. This also means that the policy itself sides with the convenience of the rich and the oppressors. Why is this true? Because the framing of the problem in media and even institutions prevent the backlash on corporations. They frame Uniqlo, Nike, and the like as companies who are green just because they did participate in the market. There's an interest to do so because, as Zen said a while ago, this is a social construct. That is to say that there are no measurements of whether you have helped enough or not. That's up to you. What's important is that you participate for prices to fluctuate or whatsoever. In Zen's framing alone, we already win because there's the importance of accountability where strict monitoring happens. Number one reason is the reason why Greta Thunberg is still protesting it now, and like because green policies have never pushed corporations to be accountable. Secondly, summits are exclusionary to indigenous groups where it is against the interests of like corporations simply because they also exploit the lands of IPs, for example. Thirdly, then, without strict monitoring, it will be easier to frame the problem as something that is equally distributed when the mistakes of the corporations are massively larger than normal people. But secondly, on rebuttals, the first response to OO is that they're uncharitable because there will be like they said that it's harmful to have dictation of prices, but they never really said the harm because Zen specifically says that the price setups depends on agreements that are legitimate. There's no arbitrary price. That is to say that they research, they have academic standards, like they have investigations, they have representatives, and even the scientific community to validate. It also means that secondly, they're more objective. It means that the price setups are more stable and doesn't fluctuate and are not based on big corporations with like the incentive to be able to manipulate these prices. And secondly, on minorities and developing countries, we say that they're the people that we would want to protect and like people would exclude from this certain responsibility because I think that their problem is imaginary. I think like minorities and developing countries are not necessarily like to be blamed for the mistakes of the world because that's necessarily the problem with oppressors. But issues then, the first one is how justified are unified carbon markets as compared to decentralized ones. That's already Zen's contribution in terms of efficiency. But I would further extend on how a society and the environment be generally safe and won't at least die in our side. And that's my extension on sustainability and how people will be affected in the long term. The first extension is why does a single carbon market help the people on the ground? Why is this important? Because on the spectrum of urgency, the unified single markets is more targeted to corporations. The people in the world then, especially developing countries and other minority groups, are not blamed for every trash in the world. This is already happening in SU. To a certain extent, there's educational programs and campaigns that are important for the youth, but it also framed Greta Thunberg to be the youth is like the main responsible for like the solving climate change, which is already calling out the corporations. It means that there's a shift of attention of the responsibility towards the people on the ground rather than the people who are necessarily like responsible for it. But secondly, on more important, the extension on how the model generates the urgency of the problem at a global scale. Why is it important? Because I think for urgency to happen, there are three steps. The first one is the visibility of the problem, and it happens on our side when there's a public understanding. You keep the individual's responsibilities, but shift the blaming towards corporations. It is important to produce critical mass because in their understanding of climate change is highly complex, but at the same time, is it simple that their understanding involves tackling of the problems and the historical silences of capitals, for example, be written in historical books. But secondly, on proportional effect, we say that there's more equality on our side when there's like where there's the absence of the bias of the rich, for example, in policies like this. And thirdly, on the action itself, we say that there's more incentive then for these corporations to specifically reach out to grassroots, to minority groups, for example, to be able to retain their or to be able to increase, for example, their carbon credits or whatsoever. That is to say that the relationship then between the capitalists, for example, or different corporations reach out to the maximum level of the people on the ground just because they are required to do so, just because we have certain standards to be able to monitor them. And for all those reasons, I think that climate change should be solved by everyone, but most especially to the like corporations and like the perpetrators. And for all those reasons,
Let us thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their wonderful remarks and invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to round up the case for opening opposition and to close the opening half. Here.
I am audible.
Yes, you're audible.
All right, let me set a timer. She, her pronouns. I take POI in chat. I'll try to take one from closing if possible. Starting in 3, 2, 1, now. When the market is used to favor big companies and oppress already fragile and infant businesses, we think already lose value. What is the OO's winning metric for this debate? We keep taking all the benefit that opening government is pushing for, but they cannot exclude out all the harms we mentioned in our case. What is the winning point OG drop in this debate? Firstly, is the challenge of their model via their own logic. They value those big companies and they say, hey, small companies doesn't really matter because they don't have that much influences. Then they also have to concede that big bargaining power, the big company holding hand. Then the DP responds bonds is invalid at this point. Because even having treaty or organization to make the price, the big company can still involve in making this decision due to how she said large power like Nike holding hand, turning it as a business tool to exclude infant businesses and kill them. Moreover, we already told you why politicians don't have that much basic knowledge for environmental protection, and therefore it's not fitting the market overall. This is a challenge that opening government failed to answer. This is the model. We prove how their model doesn't really work. It became some manipulation of their own market. Second, then they can mitigate our point about market structure challenge from their side of the world. In order for them to get effectiveness and to link in the effectiveness argument they want to make in, they cannot make those companies opt in or opt out of those markets from any time, which is to say the market structure they provide is very mandatory. That is to say that even if small businesses opt in those markets and feel harms, they can opt out immediately, and therefore harms on those infant businesses continues and therefore drag them down. Directly move on to rebuttals then. Firstly, on their clarification, PM tells us that small businesses doesn't really matter in today's debate. Three things to take this out. Firstly, we do think that small businesses matter in today's debate. Because developing nations, they're formed with various kind of small businesses. OG cannot frame them all out of this debate, or they lose big chunk of people who is producing the most amount of carbon dioxide. Secondly, then, sure, even if we exclude out all these small businesses and small market, my partner would give you two things to prove why we're still linking the benefit of big company. Firstly, international pressure still exists in our side of the world. The big companies want to perceive themselves as green and environmentally friendly. Secondly, then, competition because of capitalism still happen in our side of the world, which means that those two vital mechanizations in which OG dropped in this debate proves to you why we're linking all the benefit, because in their side, they centralize on the big companies, and our side, we can still regulate those big companies even with a voluntarily market structure. But thirdly, they sneak further of proving why the price can help those developing nation, when she literally said the developing nation is really fragile. Here, move on to their first argument. They say, principally, you cannot give out value for the carbon. Several things to take this out of this debate. Firstly, no, in their side of the world, you still have to set price. You still have to quantize the carbon anyway. So your side of the house cannot exclude out this harm either. But secondly, then, know that per to their own model, if in our side we have the free market, then this means several things. Firstly, the demand and supply in different region is different. So the price in different region is very different. It makes everyone affordable to actually buy those credit and therefore combat carbon. Secondly, then, note that in their side of the world, as per to their PM speech, when the market has international scrutiny, then it is hard to opt in and out of this market, meaning collusion and price manipulation will happen in their side, and the fragile businesses cannot escape from those manipulation and collusion. So even if in our side, the market structure sucks so much, the business can be flexibly changing and switching to another market they prefer because of what they say a free market structure, which is to say that we think that our side actually pursue a better market structure in which that every kind of company in different region have different prices they can afford to actually combat this carbon. Thirdly, let's circle back to their model, right? My partner already told you as per to their model, since they care about big companies and international organizations, they have to concede that even if international organizations are to set the price, big companies can still hold bargaining power. No price manipulation to exclude all of the small and fragile businesses. But note that those businesses are oftentimes the businesses who are lack of money to afford green technologies, who are producing the most amount of carbon dioxide towards the environment. If they are excluding out of this market, then they just not linking any environmental impact they want to push inside opening government. Lastly, they say how it's very hard to monitor the market we are pushing for. Four things to take this out. Firstly, the free market system is far more better in our side of the world. In your side, it's really better since the scale of the market is expanding with more company involved. For example, a large company like Google, Apple, or Nike. This means having international market, collusion is far more likely to happen. For example, between big companies and monopolies or oligopolies. On the local level, even with market harm, it's smaller scale and easily to regulate due to the small scale in which we're able to control. Whereas on the international scale, you're far more unlikely to sanction those behaviors, even if you know, right? Even if you know the internet it's having some problems, you can actually sanction them by any time. When it's on a smaller scale, even if those problems happen, we can easily regulate it and also exclude out the harm. Secondly, then, know that with free market structure, even if the market collapses and toss it, we can just easily opt out of the market. But on their side, they have to mandatorily opt in and opt out of the market, handling the harm within the market. That is to say that if I am an infant businesses within that kind of market, and even if the market for harms because of collusion and also price manipulation, which they drop through entire speech, I cannot opt out of the market simply because their own argument about effectiveness. But clearly, Ocean have to give you a clear characterization about what is the problem of our own market. What does it actually need monitor anyway? Since it's a free market structure, demand and supply is determining the price level and the quantity of output. We don't see any problem with that. But when you're actually getting involved, that's where the market, for example, have goods laws, have public goods laws. And we think that if this is a free market structure, we don't see any problem if it's originally a market structure. So they have never characterized how they can monitor in their side of the world. Once on the international level, who is going to monitor? How is the scale monitor? What is the degree of monitor they can actually do? But even if they're somehow able to monitor, what are they going to do to deal with those companies, for example, involving pollution or actually hurting the market, jacking up the price? But lastly, even those big companies like Nike is already so gigantic, it's linking our response about international pressure and competition to push them to be more green in our side of the world either, which is to say in their side, their own neurons, for example, have the international pressure, having competition between big companies is symmetric at either side of the world. Their neuron is not unique in their side of the world. Overall, I think the major thing we have to take from opening opposition's case is that firstly, understand that all the impact and all the benefit that OG is pushing for is symmetric on either side of the house, but we do this far more better because we give you two reasons. One, because of competition, and secondly, because of international pressure for those big companies to change. And therefore, even the metric for this debate is to be centralized on big companies. OO still take this debate. Second, then, problem in which we think that OG drop is about small companies in which they are the people who is producing a lot of carbon, for example, dioxide, and also they're the kind of company who really need those kind of carbon credit. It's been excluded out in their side of the world. They don't get to solve the problem in the root. They're the most fragile character in today's debate. And we think for all those reasons, if you really want to protect the environment and also letting those letting those fragile and also small companies to actually involve site opening opposition.
Winners thanks the deputy leader of opposition and invites the member of government to start the debate for closing off and for closing government. Here.
Hi, member of government. No preferred pronouns, POIs via voice. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. The problem with opening debate is that they do not understand the nuances of the market that they discuss. The carbon credit market does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in tandem alongside the international hierarchy, which systematically excludes developing nations from the ability to access resources needed for development. It exists parallel to capitalistic profit models and corporations that create violence in order to protect their financial interests. OG is out of the debate because they speculate on market efficiency without proving the link between the way that this market is structured towards all of their benefits beyond just assuming that centralization is a net good. OO tells us that no, the free market is better because then somehow the market will not be influenced by individual nations or corporations, even though these corporations are going to be the ones directly controlling the negotiation of carbon credits on their world. The most guaranteed thing in this debate is globalization and the way that the UN operates. They have equalized the way that nations interact with one another and have taken international discussion to the nations that need it. If both opening teams are in agreement that corporations are bad and that they should not control the market, we argue that even though the UN is not some magic incorruptible good, that they are the best actor to control the market, to regulate prices so that carbon credits are accessible. First argument, and why a unified market makes the distribution of carbon credits more equitable for everyone, especially developing nations. One, let's talk about fairness within the market system itself, right? Because in opposition, many of these countries or businesses from these countries, like developing countries, want to cooperate with international climate agreements and initiatives, and they want to gain economically from the system by selling credits, insofar as they have lots of capacity for generating credits due to natural resource abundance within these countries. However, to do so, they have to sell carbon credits to or from other organizations or nations on an individual and decentralized level. This is bad because they're more likely to be exploited in this market when there are no checks and balances against these systems. They don't have leverage because there are a diversity of different actors within the market, and they are smaller, they are less established within the system. Often international buyers know that they need these credits and therefore give less value towards their projects. But two, there are socio-economic biases against least developed countries because there's an oversaturation within these centralized markets. When both small and large nations want to sell, the credits from these nations have to compete with alternatives from bigger, more established, more connected nations like the US. The problem with this is that just because they are seen as less developed by nations, by Western corporations and countries, their credits are priced less within the market. That's what happens when you rely on supply and demand. How do we solve this on our side? One, there's unified standards that are regulated. We explain this because OG doesn't give a positive counter. Unified standards are important, not just because we can assume that it's standard in the ether that they do, but because it means there's now a UN-linked body backing a standard pricing mechanism that makes people believe that they are standard. The nations that opt into this have explicitly agreed to accept these mechanisms. They trust this agreement. There's an incentive to check back against unfair prices by other nations because they're within an organization that can sanction each other if you choose not to participate. Note that this is important because every country has somewhat equal footing within this, insofar as they are not just priced by external decentralized negotiations, but one overseeing body that is given legitimacy by the market's continued existence on an international level. It's good for developing nations in the same way that the IMF was good for them in access to credit, but two, blocks in the market and gain more bargaining power. Because within a unified system, developing countries can form economic coalitions or blocs to enhance their bargaining power from Western nations within the market, like Latin American nations, African nations with common kinds of credit projects. This comparative, where Western nations have an incentive to play them against each other and make them compete in a free market, where you have an incentive not to cooperate with your neighbor countries at the point at which you want to get the carbon credit deal rather than them. So the political power as a collective of these nations is far greater under our side because they actually have an incentive to collectivize. But two, we think that it encourages global visibility of credits for vulnerable regions. Many vulnerable regions who need carbon credits the most from their environmental projects due to things like poverty or need for aid are disadvantaged in opposition because they aren't reached out to on opposition in their decentralized system. Their nations are not deemed as developed and they're not deemed as profitable. They are not geographically proximate to nations that have the money to actually sell carbon credits. Their governments are deemed as not legitimate by Western corporations or nations. They are seen as unreliable or unstable for credits due to ethnic and regional tensions. Why do we change this under our side? When there's a global market, there's an international mechanism in the market to promote your credits, to have it verified and be checked, and for them to be endorsed by the UN. We think that's important for developed nations and nations that do not fall under the protection of like established countries in the West. But three, we think that there are better accountability and transparency mechanisms that protect them. And this is in response to OO when they say that, oh, small businesses, small countries can't buy carbon credits, right?
Yes.
Decentralized market actually look like? This is an opt-in system where organizations with proven environmental initiatives are able to sell. So this is an opt-in system and where you can sell just because you like planted a few trees. What does it mean when organizations are able to opt into this cap trade system without centralized oversight? Balances do not exist because there is no central committee regulating the price of credits or overseeing the behavior of these organizations. OO says that, oh, companies are going to be able to lobby governments in order to raise or lower prices, and that's so bad because they're capitalists. We argue that market manipulation is more likely on their side because corporations are the ones selling carbon credits in the first place. Big governments that want to exploit like poorer countries are the ones selling carbon credits on their side because it's a free market. So whoever has the most resources are going to dominate. There's an incentive to negotiate in bad faith to nations without leverage and without privilege. Standard it's far better under our side because now all transactions are tracked, seen, placed within the like regulated market system, and like standard verification lessens the degree of extreme coercion or fraud by Western nations or corporations at the point where they can't do this anonymously and without transparency. How do you position CG's contributions within the debate? One, we prove why this market is far more accessible and equitable for developing nations. These are the most important nations that only CG benefits in this debate because they need equitability within the market to get the fairest prices of credits to be able to develop their countries. They are the ones most harmed by environmental problems like climate change. On a principled level, the market should reparate for these harms done to these nations for damage and extractions of their natural resources. But we argue then largely that the purpose of a carbon credit market is this: you limit the magnitude of carbon emissions by capitalistic actors, and you allow them these emissions only if their harm to the environment if all is offset by another one doing good. We argue that all the benefits of a carbon credit market in the first place do not exist if companies or governments do not opt in. We tell you that they are not able to opt in if you do not give them the choice to. For all those reasons, propose things.
Last thanks the member of government for their beautiful remarks and invite the member of opposition to extend the opposition's case. Here, here.
Hello. I'm not the one speaking. Hello, am I visible and audible?
Yes, sure.
All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In an incredibly messy debate, closing opposition will win by doing two things. One, offering clarity as to how the carbon market works and what carbon credit is. And additionally, we're going to be the first teams in opposition to actually defend why a decentralized voluntary market is better, engaging with what their side wants to say in terms of opt-in. First of all, what is a carbon credit? So the motion takes inspiration from a specific type of policy that was done back then called carbon cap and trade, where there's a body that issues limits to how much you can pollute, and there are specific carbon obligations that you have to do in terms of corporate social responsibility. There's a market in the sense that you're allowed to trade those obligations, you're allowed to buy, sell, and finance these things. And this is very important for the debate because the debate isn't about a debate about price. The central body is going to issue credits. It is impossible for the central body to track every single transaction that exists with businesses and nations to force them to follow and adopt one specific price point. Or you can regulate in terms of a price floor and a price ceiling. Ultimately, the players and the agents that will buy not buy in, but be participating within this global carbon market are going to still have supply and demand factors be applying on both sides of the debate, whether or not it's a single unified carbon market or whether or not it's a decentralized market. So the free market exists on either side of the debate. The debate isn't about green free markets and whether or not they're good. The debate is about two things. One, the size of the market, whether or not you want it to be in a global level or on a regional scale in different parts of the world, and whether or not it's important that you have consent. So a government force individuals to participate in this carbon credit system versus on our side where you have to willingly join and choose to be in that carbon market, which is where the debate takes place. We're willing to trade off that some people don't opt in, but that's fine, which is where we move on to the first extension. We think that the problem with their model is that a single unified carbon market will be toothless and ineffective. The premise of an effective carbon market is that it has the capacity to regulate and enforce businesses and nations to comply with their credit obligations, i.e., the amount they're allowed to pollute, and forcing them to do green activities like engaging in investments in renewable technology. The problem is that there are numerous structural reasons that make regulation moot and impossible. One, because you're going to, as different nations, lobby to weaken the regulatory power because you perceive this body as an attack against sovereignty. Note the nuance of the motion. Our version of the world is one where carbon markets are voluntary. The world of government is a world where they are involuntary, which means you will perceive this as an attack and want to weaken the power of that body in the form of making zero regulation. Problem is, there will be hegemonic nations with a perverse incentive to make these different things very low in terms of the green activities required. Take a look at, for example, what China did in terms of how it is a body that weakened the power of the Kyoto Protocol, or Brazil, which is going to make the amount of obligations very favorable towards them. The way the opening opposition explains their big country analysis is, well, we're going to have big countries force the price to be in a specific way. It's not about the price, it's about the credit mechanism of forcing states to follow that specific obligation, given that the law, they're going to sex a lot of big players with workers' incentives to want to do things like pollute, which is why, for instance, China does not follow the Kyoto Protocol, or the US, in terms of them not following the Paris Climate Agreement. We think that it's also going to be an ineffective body. Reason why is that there's going to be a lot of red tape and gridlock in terms of enforcing these climate targets. Because, and here's why about opening government, when you put it at a global stage, you slow down accountability exponentially when there are countries that simply cannot meet these net zero targets for emissions. What are we going to do? For Bhutan or the Philippines, that they have to limit the amount of pollution to an X percent, even though they can't fulfill that requirement as a result of them needing to industrialize and protect farmers on the ground, or tell different countries in South Africa, even if they don't have proper markets. The problem with their policy is that they lead to punishment, and because no one wants punishment, they're likely going to force the body to not comply with that. Similar to how the International Criminal Court exists, but even if it exists, it can't regulate anyone at that point. So this argument independently takes down all of the government analysis, because sure, it will exist, but it won't be a regulating force that is good. The next extension that I want to launch is, and here's why I build a comparative that open opposition simply doesn't explain, is why is a decentralized voluntary carbon market stronger in terms of their enforcement mechanism? Here's where I will answer the challenge coming from government, how you make them fulfill their obligation, which is the closing government question. The difference under our side is you willingly consented into these regional markets and take on these environmental regulations and obligations. You chose, as for instance, a country in the European Union to sign into the CBAM mechanism, which is like the Austria's quarters, where you, in order for you to follow that specific price mechanism and those specific credit obligations, which means you have more loyal members, but which means as well you're able to issue carbon credits that are more nuanced and attuned to their economic needs. So the EU or the ASEAN, for instance, are going to make smaller states that have minimal capacity to do green activities allowance of economic independence and improve standards of living by relaxing the carbon targets that they have to meet versus that of other countries. The problem is that on their world, you homogenize obligations that all countries have to make under this one size fits all of trying to have this unified carbon market, rather than being more nuanced and attuned to their needs, which is the problem with their side. Because we don't punish states that simply cannot meet those targets. But the last reason why is, let's assume and play ball that the debate is about price. The problem is that if you don't buy into supply and demand factors, you create shortages, you create surplus because of classic like Econ 102, where if you try to set a price floor or a price ceiling, there's simply excess artificial demand or excess artificial supply, which means that you don't create efficient systems that allow for the greatest environmental outcomes. So this accountability defense of the counterfactual is the biggest argument in the debate. Because the premise of any carbon market is its ability to regulate and force them to do environmental actions. First side makes people make solar panels, makes people not pollute, makes people have better carbon emissions, and do all of the different things that every other team wants to do in the debate. So this argument is a prerequisite to unlocking every other impact, given that consent is what allows you to build the necessary environmental capacities for you to engage in the green activities that all teams wanted to have in this debate. For those reasons, propose.
Jesus thanks the member of OP for their great remarks and invites the government whip to close the debate for the government side.
Hello, am I audible? Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you're audible.
Just to confirm. Hello, am I audible and visible? I was a bit muted there. Hello?
Yes, you're audible and visible.
Okay. So we'll take a PY through chat. Also, Zed, stop chatting because you're notifying my messenger. Okay. So we'll start taking probably from 5 or 6. Okay. So also from opening. Okay. So starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We agree with CO the debate that opening half ignores is about the market on a global scale. How is it more likely for it to be better or worse when it is an international market that people have binding commitments to participate in, to have regulatory bodies that enforce it? As CEO explains, that is not likely to be effective. We're going to explain, as I already explained as Chelsea's case, why it's far more likely to be equitable for the most vulnerable nations within this debate. So note, I'm going to do a couple of things in this speech. Number one, I'm going to respond to opening opposition and their case on why the free market or decentralized systems in general are far more likely to be effective. Probably don't think that's the case for a bunch of different reasons. Number two, I'm going to respond to CEO on their case on why it's more likely than not that this market is going to be far less more efficient or far less have degree of influence within these nations. I'm going to explain why that's not true because of the very simple mechanisms that Chelsea already explained. And lastly, I'm going to weigh in against OG because insofar as OG only gives an argument on why the central system is good, we provide all of the mechanisms for not only one, the efficiency that they claim, but two, the equitability that is the guaranteed delta with this debate that they don't actually capitalize on within their speeches. So firstly, then an opening opposition. Their main claim on their side is that, well, companies will lobby governments to lower prices to make it easier to buy carbon credits, insofar as it's the case that, if there's a unified system. Number one, this is the same argument that closing opposition runs. So I'm going to respond to it within opening opposition. Note that firstly, they have to prove that many of these nations, at the point where there's an international system, will want to do this and lobby in the first place at the point where the climate change issue is prevalent within their election cycles, and then expend significant political capital to say that you are against regulatory bodies like the United Nations, in which opening government has the mechanism and they no one in response to, insofar as the way in which this run, right? How are they more likely to get this as a form of collective lobby against this particular kind of regulatory pricing? They have to prove why they're more likely to do this. They have to prove why they get the critical mass. But two, this is already a binding commitment. Opposition says they need consent on their side. This is quite bad because it's a cascading effect. At the point which we're more likely than not to have individual kinds of and ways in which you price these kind of credits within your individual kind of, like negotiations within your decentralized market. Under our side of the house, it's far more likely at the point where it's more transparent that there's less of these like sort of bad faith deals. But thirdly, there's interlinked economic interests. Chelsea already explained there's quite an interest in terms of supply and demand for the prices being verified and checked by this international body. It's closing opposition says this can't happen. This is quite happen in things like international market systems, like the way in which debt is restructured by the IMF is not. I'm not particularly sure why it's hard to check the value of these particular credits, right? It's far more likely as it equalizes towards the actual value of these credits. It's quite beneficial for every single nation that participates in. But four, if you don't believe that, it's the legitimacy of the international body of the UN, right? Like UN has done a bunch of different things. UN has done, the IMF, the World Bank, all of these existing things that have, improved global cooperation. So there's an incentive for them to participate in good faith within the market, as we already explained from Chelsea, that takes on their case. The second thing they say is that the free market is better because competition means prices will be lower. There's a couple of responses to this. Chelsea already responds in a bit in terms of the first one, in terms of a couple of mechanisms, but a couple of responses to this. Four responses. Number one, information asymmetry. I am not sure why the free market is absolutely the best thing, because you don't know what the kind of negotiations Western nations make towards other nations that are smaller, the other side of the world. There's a geographical proximity or information issue at the point where you don't know what these negotiations are, whether they're done in good faith. For example, this is a missing mechanism that OG doesn't explain, because at best they just respond to decentralized, but still someone is able to know about the information. I would argue they don't. They probably do it a lot in like shitty backroom deals. For example, with the leaders of these nations at the point where they're more able to sell these credits at lower prices. But two, inefficiencies and inconsistencies. A decentralized system could lead to plethora of carbon like markets, as we already explained, with varying standards, making it difficult to ensure consistent pricing and valuation of carbon credits. At best, the free market doesn't check itself because they can have individual negotiations. They're probably the case you don't have many people giving you offers for your credits at the point where you're a small developed nation, as we already explained, that don't get a lot of deals. But three, there's obviously the case barrier to new entrants, as we already explained, that you're probably not as well known, you're probably not as well trusted and valued for your particular kind of credit projects, which means that you have less deals, you have less accessibility in general to sell these things, and it's quite bad. So already then we explained why the competition mechanism that I explained on the reverse side is not efficient. What does CEO give in this debate? At best, they give a mechanistic quibble on why nations are less likely to cooperate within the system. But a lot of this is already responded to coming from opening opposition. They have to prove why this is itself coming as opening government, already sets up in this debate and is not responded to, right? This is an international body that everyone is binded to and cooperating with. There's significant political capital expenditure to go against this body because they say that they need consent, which is quite bad. At best, under our side, everyone has to do it. If they're not doing it, they're seen as a rogue nation, for example, that doesn't care about the things like climate change initiatives, etc. Even if it's not the best kind of pricing under our side, it's a standard pricing, which means that the worst thing that can happen under our side is a little bit more expensive, but it's regulated and it's more likely to be fair for the nations that are more likely to get bad kinds of deals on opposition. So already then we respond to closing opposition as well. Insofar as they question the mechanism, I'm not sure why particularly this is true. What did Chelsea give you in this debate that was completely underspotted to by the unresponsive last speaker? Number one, she explained why the unified market makes the distribution of credits far more equitable for everyone. This is the most guaranteed delta in the same way that we saw the United Nations equalizing many of the footing of the least developed nations within the global system, for example. One, in terms of fairness within the system, as we already explained, because it's more likely than not that are able to gain and have better kinds of pricing, better kinds of access towards unified standards, for example, which means that they get better deals. But two, as already CEO doesn't respond to, they can form blocks within the market and gain more bargaining power versus the comparative where they pitted against each other as already exists for many of African nations or many of these like Latin American nations, for example, on their side. I'll take the POI from David.
So, you know what we would call it if you could have blocks in a universal market? We would call those voluntary decentralized markets. This is literally opposition.
No, because again, there's no incentive for them to cooperate at the point where it's voluntary because now it's only opt-in. They're not forced to do so, and there's no like incentive for you to cooperate because you want to compete within these voluntary markets that are decentralized. Under our side, there's now more transparency that you have an incentive, a common reason to cooperate within blocks in this international system. Under our side, you can't skirt this debate by a POI. So lastly then, what do we explain in terms of why this is better? Number one, for fairness, insofar as they're more likely than not to have better prices, better kinds of political power. But two, in terms of global visibility in the first place for them to be able to sell these credits, especially for the most vulnerable nations. But three, in terms of accountability and transparency mechanisms internally that OG does not explain, at the point where it's more likely than not, therefore safer times of credit, for example, that reduces the amount of fraud, that reduces the amount of exploitation that I experience. This is the most important thing because OG does not position why this is important when you have a better kind of market mechanism. Because one, many of these nations are the most kinds of nations that need the best form of or more like equitable form of pricing insofar as they're able to be more developed over the period of time and able to contribute and make more of these projects which solve the environmental problem. But two, on a principled level, as Chelsea already explains, the nation as the global nation as a whole has a responsibility to give them the best kinds of pricing at the point where they have the nations that are most principally harmed by the damage of climate change, and therefore we need them to have the better kind of system that does not exploit them under our side of the house. The credit market is far better at the point which becomes internationalized and it becomes a binding commitment for everyone to have standardized kinds of ways of dealing with the climate change issue. For those reasons, very proud to propose.
Sorry for that, Vic. This house thanks the government whip and invites opposition whip to close the debate for this quarterfinals. Here.
Hello, hello.
Yeah, you're clearly audible.
Thank you. I'll just timer, papers. Okay. Timer, papers. I will fix the papers. Okay. Mm, all right. Starting in three, two, one. The problem that Garcia identifies is yes, government may talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. That is, sure, you have everyone participating. Sure, you guarantee that everyone is in a carbon market. But the question that we uniquely launched was in the construction of this carbon market, is it one in which you are able to enforce it properly? Is it one in which each individual carbon credit actually had weight? Actually had teeth. Insofar as we're able to prove that it doesn't have teeth, that they can't enforce it properly, that is the point at which government falls and which we're far more engaging than opening opposition. The first thing I want to do in this speech is just explain how we extend past what opening opposition says about developing countries. Because if you look past all of the veneer of opening opposition, all they're saying really is just developing countries are worse off because some big countries will dominate the market. The problem with this is there's no tangible reason from OO why developing countries are any better on their side. So this is a negative case. So we just say that because you have different markets, there's like just because you have different markets, right? Like there's no explanation why the actions themselves would be good coming from OO. Only that carbon credits will be more accessible, but it doesn't prove that it is good accessibility. We do because they do prove good actions, which is what the extension was. I will first explain how we respond to CG and clarify all of the response they have to our case, and then I'll do two issues. Firstly, what the carbon market looks like, and then secondly, where can we better enforce the carbon market given this distinction that we clarify coming from CO. Firstly, let's talk about CG. So essentially what the CG extension is, right, is governments are seen as unreliable because they can't enforce it properly versus a comparative where you have a UN-linked body that makes people believe that it is fair when they consent. There are two glaring problems with this. The first glaring problem that I have with this is it assumes, right, that people can consent. That is to say, yes, sure, it might be a prefers a world motion, but never do they prove why people are okay with this, why they are okay with every single perfect term that they want to assert under closing government. So it's far more likely, as what we say, that is, even if there is some resistance, they're far more likely to make sure that the quality of each individual carbon credit massively goes down, which is why the participation is much worse on their side. Secondly, this assumes that it can be enforced properly. The extension proves that it cannot. They don't explain this, and therefore our material is inherently responsive to theirs. What were their responses to our extension? The first thing that they said was that consent doesn't matter in this debate because we're going to guarantee that people are going to opt in anyway, so consent is secondary. But the extension was not that consent affects the existence of participation. It's about the construction of that participation and the quality of that participation. But on their side, when countries know that they cannot, buy too many credits, when countries know that they have their own implicit priorities, that is the point at which there's overwhelming demand to make sure that the kind of carbon credit that exists on their side is incredibly moot. The second thing that they say is voluntary equals nobody cares. So obviously, I would like to point out just on vibes, right? Like if you believe this argument, like this just means that carbon markets just won't exist ever because nobody wants to give up anything for like climate change, etc. So clearly there has to be some impetus or some consensus that being green is important in this debate. Clearly this is an uncomparative response. The next thing I'll point out then is what the hell does a carbon market look like? Because if government bench, besides GovWorks, so yes, thank you Largo, accepted any POI, they would realize that it is not about a market it is not a bit about price, because it is a bit about a market, right? Everyone opts into a market, so supply and demand will always exist. Prices will still change. So it's not about prices, it is about the enforcement, the issuance of credits, regulation of those credits. So opening government and closing government, like saying that it is dependent on fluctuation, entirely is unexclusive. But secondly, we prove it as far more nuanced insofar as able to separate it into different regions, which means that the ability to track is just far more important. Because what our extension pointed out, when you have huge reasons why the construction is likely going to be far more nuanced on the our side, when you know that the individual voluntary regions are going to be doing the best that they can, the overwhelming demand will make the value of credits lower, which is why the more sovereign way of opting in is a lot more effective. Next then, where can you better enforce the carbon market? So I want to deal with opening government here and explain how we enter the debate, because I don't think opening opposition really talks about the enforceability of the carbon market. Government says you cannot enforce the decentralized market. They give three mechanisms to this. I will do it line by line. The first mechanism they give is it is hard to monitor, and GovWorks echoes this. The flip here is it is harder on scale on their side. Like their logic. They're just like, you can't monitor every transaction. It's far harder on the other side when it is one body doing it, as closing government asserts, one UN body doing it, versus on our side where it's far easier if it's several markets, you can split the work of it. So if we're talking about the ability to monitor it, clearly it is easier on our side. Secondly, they say businesses can negotiate the price to be low. But the problem with this is it exists on their side, right? Because some businesses, some countries, most countries, as we point out coming from our side, still want a low price, still want a like a toothless carbon market, right? So they will still try to do it on their side. The problem is the solution to our side is we isolate the harm. Because yes, some corporations might hate this, some countries might hate this, but we guarantee that the markets that do opt in are the ones that are able to do the most work. There's a unified system in which people are far less able to opt in because it's far more like far less nuanced for what they can do. Thirdly, they say it's an inconsistent effort. You can't hold it accountable because nobody understands anything or why prices change. Three things. One, this unfair prices changing means an inconsistent effort. As government proves, climate change will always be important, so universal effort will always exist. Secondly, this is a burden pain. Like it is a world reset. Surely there will be information if it is global. There's no proof otherwise. CG likes this as well. Thirdly, put this out of the market, it is far easier to rat them out because now the standard of what is green is if you are willing to join that market, which is why it's a clear signaling mechanism as to how you can differentiate one company that is willing to be green rather than the other. So clearly, if it is unified, it is far less able to be nuanced on the other side of the house. What do we say then? We explain that the voluntary market is the only way to have teeth. Because the problem is regulation is impossible. Firstly, countries care about sovereignty. So in the conception of what the carbon market is, they want to make sure that the constraints of sovereignty are very low. Secondly, hegemony cashes in when we push ceilings up because countries want to push their own agendas. Thirdly, red tape and structural inhibitions to be able to opt into further climate change action. So these several reasons prove that there's an overwhelming demand to push down the impact of each individual carbon credit on their side of the house, versus on our side, we can isolate all of these farms. Why is it then far easier and regulated? Quite simply because of the quality of opt-in. So opening opposition only debates half of the round. They only debate decentralized. They only explain why it's important it has to be voluntary. Yes, less people might opt in under our side of the house, but these are the individuals, industries, and countries that will do the things that are most necessary, that will actually build more solar panels, that will actually build more nuclear power plants, that will actually make sure that we make seawalls and do things that matter. Versus on their side of the house, nobody will be able to do it. Nobody can do it because it's only one market dictated by a bunch of countries that try to force a kind of market that makes sure that it is toothless. You can only walk the walk under our side of the house. That is why closing oppositions in the semi.
This us thanks the opposition whip for rounding up the debate. Thank you everyone for what was a wonderful round. As you all know, it's quarterfinals, so there's not going to be any form of rankings or oral education. Just join the main Zoom call when it's time. The results are going to be announced. Yeah, thank you everyone for that. So